Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to our webinar, our fourth reINVENT and rebuild webinar with the World Health Organization. My name is Amanda Harding, and I'm just giving a little bit of an informal welcome. We will be starting in about 3 minutes, but for those of you who are already with us, it's great to have you joining us today. I can see quite a few people starting to come in. Just as a reminder, I'm sure some of you have been to some of our earlier webinars as well, but we will be recording this session. We will be using the Q&A function, the Zoom webinar Q&A function as well. So if you want to pop your questions to the panelists, that's the way to do it. Please don't use the chat function. We will not be using or looking at the chat. We'll only be looking at the Q&A. We'll try and weave those questions in when we can. And we've asked the panelists as well, if they get a chance to sort of keep an eye on them and just to respond to you if they can do that as well. As I said, this is the fourth of our webinars, and you should be able to get a sense of the other 3 webinars that we've had already on the WHO website as well, just to be able to keep up with where we've been and where we're going. So there's more, as you can see, there's a QR code there. You can actually just use that QR code and you'll get more information. I'm terrible at thinking about the QR codes, but I'm getting better at it as we go. Again, just informally, I'm going to be moderating the webinar today, which is why I'm doing this sort of informal welcome as everybody comes into our space. It is a largely informal conversation. It's a content-rich conversation, and we're talking about a great subject around the real potential of civil society organizations in this space of sport and physical activity, and particularly where that comes to working through sport for those social and development outcomes. I think on that note, I will turn into something a little bit more formal, because I can see that we've actually had a few people just joining in the last minute or so. So my name is Amanda Harding. I lead Convene, and it really is my honor to be moderating this fourth reINVENT Rebuild webinar, Hidden in Plain Sight, realizing the potential of civil society and providing access to sport and physical activity for all. At this point, though, I am going to hand over to Fiona Bull, who has been leading the charge really on bringing these webinars together and will be chairing the webinar today. Fiona, over to you, and then I'll pick it up afterwards.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and a very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining this fourth webinar of the reINVENT and Rebuild webinar series being hosted by WHO to look at the sport and physical activity agenda. Welcome back if you've been participating in previous weeks, and a very warm welcome if this is your first time joining us for this particular webinar, and we hope you'll stay and rejoin. There is a series of 8 and we're approaching halfway through. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to colleagues from WHO, headquarters, regional offices, countries, ministries of health and sport, and other government departments, and all of you working in the sport, physical activity, and health sector, professionals, practitioners, researchers alike. A very warm welcome. The origins of this reINVENT and Rebuild webinar series are the 2021 International Day of Sport for Development and Peace, April 6th. And it's a day in which we celebrate the value of sport to all of the different ways it contributes to society, through health, physical and mental health, and through things such as enjoyment, friendship, skills, employment, and a range of other social and economic benefits. This year, 2021, and last year, 2020, were days of reflection. The impact of COVID-19 pandemic has hit the sector and sport and physical activity particularly hard for all of us individually. But on this day, it was also an opportunity to reflect how it's impacted on the ecosystem of the many different stakeholders that provide the sports and physical activity opportunities to so many, to many who need it most, and to many who are in disadvantaged communities or in displaced communities. This series is continuing the reflection started on April 6th and continuing to look at how the impact and the adaptation that is taking place is unfolding. And we're now shifting to looking forward at how this can be seen as an opportunity to collectively build forward better, a stronger and fairer ecosystem of sport and physical activity, so that it can provide those opportunities to all people in all places. This is a process and a product, because through the webinars, we are listening to the panel and to the questions and the answers so that we can learn and share and build our knowledge collectively in the ecosystem. But there is a product, and the product is WHO is literally listening and recording so that we can use the recommendations, the discussions that arise to inform a document that we will plan to publish in the autumn, September 2021, on these recommendations to provide a guidance on how the learning can be taken forward into building forward a stronger, fairer system. And it's in this series today that we will be looking at how we can improve, strengthen and build the sport for development community. We've called the seminar and identified this as a hidden sector. And it's in fact, we want to draw the curtains back, put the spotlight on, because it provides such a valuable contribution to the ecosystem. We want to give full voice to hearing from those in this area and their views and yours on how we can build the system and have more people using sport as an instrument and as a tool for both health and social outcomes. The dialogue we're going to enter now continues, as in previous weeks, a very informal, but very practically focused, very honest. Problems as well as challenges will be raised. Critical, challenging, but always positive and looking forward so we can have those action-focused recommendations. We've been learning a lot over the last 4 weeks, and I'm sure today is going to only add to it. There's a collective need to change, a readiness for change, an agreement that we need to bridge between many parts of this ecosystem, private, public, government, UN, and all the communities. We've got much bridge building to do. We need to build capacity, and we need to use evidence and be accountable for impact. And I think some of those themes are going to be picked up today. I'm very much looking forward to the presentations and discussions that unfold, and I welcome you again and hand the floor back to Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona. So just very briefly, how we're going to actually make the next 90 minutes work. As Fiona said, in these 90 minutes, a little bit under now, we want to bring light to both the current contribution and the huge potential of civil society as an enabler and provider of sport for health, for social and for development outcomes. We're going to hear about how sport and physical activity contribute to this wide range of social outcomes as individuals, but also enabling greater community cohesion, as well as reinforcing a city's own well-being. The webinar will take a look on how, on the one hand, we can strengthen civil society organizations, and on the other, how can we increase the actual numbers, make wider that pool to be able to make that contribution that we're going to be looking at. As throughout our webinar series, we will seek, just as Fiona just said, proposals from our panelists and from you as well, the audience. What are the actions, the policies, the partnerships that we need if we're going to really reach the potential and ambitions of civil society? We would also like to see your questions, as I already mentioned. These can be posted on the Zoom Q&A at the bottom of your screen, not in the chat. Please do use the Q&A. We'll try and weave them into our conversation as we talk through the next 90 minutes, but we'll also have the WHO team and our panelists trying to answer those questions directly. All of that, of course, time allowing. There's a lot to get through in 90 minutes. And this is my reminder as well to the panelists. let's really try and keep to the message. We have a lot of stories to tell in this group. So who have we got on the panel today? We've got a fantastic group of panelists. Julien Beaugrasset, who is a youth leader and is a sport coach trainee. And we'll hear a little bit about Julien and his own journey and that motivation and what that really looks like for others who are wanting to enter into this space, both as a trainee, as a sport coach, but also looking for those social outcomes, looking at sport for development in that way. We've also got Ollie Dudfield, Executive Director for Sport for the Sport for Development Coalition. This is a movement of organizations working to maximize the positive social impact of sport and physical activity. This is based in the UK. And Ollie comes with an international background of having worked in the Commonwealth as well, amongst lots of other things. I'm always worried about actually missing out everything that everybody has done. Adam Fraser is the CEO of Laureus Sport for Good Foundation. And for those who don't know so much about Laureus, we'll hear a little and we'll see a video about that later, but Laureus is funding programs that impact and empower young people across the world through sport. Mike McWhinney is coming from Sport Canada, so the federal government of Canada, and is running the Sport for Social Development in Indigenous Communities Sport Support Program. And again, Mike is working at the moment on that domestic scene, but comes as well having worked internationally. Last but not least, Lydia Murungi, who is working at the moment for AVSI Uganda and is the manager of the consortium manager of Game Connect. We'll hear a lot about Game Connect, a sport for protection initiative working with youth, both refugees, but also from youth from host communities in Uganda. So as you can see, it's an international crowd. For some, it's early in the morning as well. So thank you for making the effort. And we'll hear a lot more about how they're doing their work, how to actually see us being able to strengthen and grow this civil society movement as we go forward. To be able to kickstart that conversation, I'm going to turn straight away to Ollie. So if we're talking about strengthening, increasing that number of civil society organizations using sport and physical activity, not only to benefit health, a very important point, but also as a key for achieving social and development outcomes, we want to actually hear from you, Ollie. What does this actually look like? Can you describe the purpose of sport for development? The role that civil society sector has to play, what it's already doing in this area. We talk about it being hidden, but what does that actually look like in practice if it's really hidden? So over to you, Ollie, to just help us set the scene, and then maybe to come back to you afterwards, just to help us define a little bit more, even what we mean by CSOs, civil society organizations.
If I was going to set the scene as requested, I'd say sport for development, it's not new. It's not without evidence, but it's not at scale. I say it's not new because if we're going to define sport for development, the 2003 definition from the UN Interagency Task Force on Sport for Development is as useful as any. Now, of course, the Youth of Sport for Wider Outcomes, non-sport outcomes, predates that time period, but the definition that it's the intentional use of sport and physical activity to attain or contribute to specific and targeted development and peace objective really helps set the scene, and particularly that intentionality and the focus on non-sport outcomes. I mean, if we're going to dive a bit deeper into the type of organisations, the type of civil society organisations that are involved in this sector, and the network of the Sport for Development Coalition is a good way to look at that. We, of course, across 180 networks, groups, organisations that overarch thousands of projects and programs, have sport organisations from professional down to community level, but also have health organisations. We have community development organisations, youth-led organisations, employability charities, all working and aiming to use sport to deliver wider outcomes. A good example at present, number of organisations in the network looking at increasing youth unemployment on the back of COVID, 14.5%, but only about just over 50% of young people actually in jobs. Putting mentoring, counselling support around sport-related activity on employability to help transition young people into employment, education or training. Similar type methodology and approach across issues to do with entry into the justice system, health and wellbeing, in particular, and a wide range of community development. Networks not alone, the similar networks of civil society organisations, Sport for Social Change Network, 130 organisations across 14 sub-Saharan African countries, Good Push Network, 200 plus organisations using skateboarding and youth development connectivity that across about 60 countries, even the European Football for Development Network, around 200 football clubs, their community arms looking to deliver community outcomes. But as I said, not without evidence either. But I do get worried and must underscore it's not a panacea, and we shouldn't see sport as a panacea at all. I get nervous sometimes around the use of power of sport in this space because the evidence is clear. And it's the same evidence that's there for a range of social policy interventions, whether it be non-formal education, whether it be community development, and that is that the length of time of the intervention, the placement of counselling, mentoring, support services around the sport-based intervention, it being community-driven and context-specific, having a skilled leader or trainer, absolutely critical. If there was one power of sport or one area that I really underscore in this evidence base, it can deliver a double return. So it can deliver that social outcome, might be around supporting or contributing to employability into the justice system, but equally people are getting active and we're helping to get people move. And that's probably key to underscore. And just to close on this opening bit, it's not at scale. And that's the challenge I think it's worth discussing. UNICEF, a number of years ago, looked at the evidence for child-centred sport for development. Estimated there's only 1 in 500 children being able to access sport for development initiatives. Add that to the fact we know 81% of adolescents don't meet physical activity guidelines, and this issue of scale is probably an important one in setting the scene.
Thanks so much, Ollie. So you have really set the scene. You started talking about intentionality. You sort of talked us through that huge diversity within this community. You can't hardly call it one community, this community within a global movement. And then you talk to the fact that it's not reaching its potential, as far as I can see. We're not going to scale. It could go to scale. And also, I guess, just a warning shot in terms of the evidence and, you know, the power of sport. And that at the same time, I really like the way you sort of came back at the end with that sort of that double shot at the same time. With that huge diversity out there, though, there clearly are a whole range of challenges to actually then sort of shift it from the challenge to what do we actually need to start addressing? What are the focus areas, those priorities that you think that we need to be looking at if we're actually going to see this very diverse movement, community start to reach its potential?
Mobilise more of this diverse community. There's a great, when you say civil society, such a diverse and different and wide-ranging community. World Bank defines civil society, they refer to community groups, non-government organisation, labour unions, Indigenous people organisations, disabled people's organisations, charitable organisations, faith-based organisations. The World Economic Forum put forward reference research a number of years ago that looked at the NGO sector only across 40 countries. The operating expenditure, 2.2 trillion, 54 million paid staff, 350 million volunteers. As a comparator, global sports market, and that includes the entertainment and elite side of global sport, about 480 billion. In Europe, there's only 1.3 million employed in sport, and that probably has the best data and most mature market, one of the most mature markets. There's a real potential there to mobilise more and a wider range of this civil society world to embed sport and physical activity in their programming.
So you're going to have to get used to me interrupting. Everybody will get used to me interrupting, of course. Given you've pointed again to that potential which is there, what are those priority areas, though, that then we need to focus on to actually lever that potential? That's really the focus of what we want to be talking about today.
I'd suggest 4 focus areas. And I don't want to sound like a politician, use a slogan, but they all start with P. First would be policy and investment, and particularly policy investment, of course, within sport and physical activity related, but in particular beyond sport and physical activity policy and investment. I think there's a real question around people, skills, and workforce. What is the skills, the competencies that are required across the workforce within sport and physical activity? More importantly, what can be embedded in training offers, competency frameworks, national skills frameworks, in civil society, in youth development, in community health? There's an issue around program methodology. I spoke to it before. A traditional sport and physical activity often won't speak to that diversity of civil society. It needs to start with the wider outcome, work back from there, have that intentionality, have those specific characteristics I spoke to before, and critically, have an equity lens, have a safeguarding lens, and really focus on rights. And then lastly, I think the places and spaces, moving away from big stadia focus to accessible community spaces, be they green spaces, be they community hubs, be they linking and getting behind and within education facilities and health. So policy, people, program methodology, places and spaces would be the focus from my side.
Ollie, thanks. And that really does help us set the scene for what's to come, because I think every one of our panelists is going to, in one way or another, talk to your 4 Ps, if you like. We'll try not to sound like politicians at the same time, or, I guess, policy gurus. We'll actually keep to what that really, and unpack those a little bit. And to help, Ollie, I'm going to come back to you a little bit later, but I'd like to bring in right away Lydia to help us do some of that unpacking, because we do need to unpack what do we actually mean by any of this. And Lydia, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today. Just so everybody can just sort of place you a little bit, you are in Kampala, where you're working for AVSI Uganda, an international NGO working across 32 countries, running programs in Uganda since the mid-1980s. As I mentioned to you before, I knew AVSI in my older, wearing other hats, in the mid-90s, working with refugees from South Sudan. So an organization that's really well established in Uganda. However, you've only just started to use sport interventions as part of your programs, that intentionality that Ollie was just talking about, that outcome-based approach that Ollie was just talking about as well. So maybe you can just tell us, just why have you even started to do this, and why are you doing it now, and why not, those in the mid-90s when I started to get to know AVSI?
Thank you, Amanda. And as AVSI, we are very delighted to be part of this webinar and share what we've been doing as AVSI. Just to say, we may all know that sport is a very attractive activity for young people. At AVSI, at least 80% of our participants in our projects are young people. So we really needed something that could help us gather them. And as an organization over time, we have implemented youth programs and have realized that youth experience several challenges, things that you might know, including abuse, violence, things around isolation, exclusion, limited economic and social opportunities, disruptions in their daily life and schooling, and of course, increasingly suffering from psychological and mental stress and anxiety. And we've been able to acknowledge that sport is essential for the physical and mental health. And that's why most of our programs have psychosocial support streamlined into them. And it's also partly the reason why we are very excited about the Game Connect, a sport for protection project funded by the Olympic Refuge Foundation and implemented in a consortium of 5 partners, AVSI as lead. We have another partner, the Uganda Olympic Committee, UNHCR, Youth Sport Uganda, and Right to Play. We are very pleased with this partnership because we are leveraging on each other's strength to implement this project. The why now?
I'm just gonna interrupt you again. As I said, interruption is part of what is part of the game today. Why now? Because we've heard a little bit about, yes, you can leave a sport, but why are you doing it now? What is particular about where AVSI is now in terms of its own development, also what is maybe happening in the wider context in Uganda? What has pushed you to actually, only in the last 2 years, let's be clear, that you've actually put in place this program?
Yes, we all know what's going on more than ever with the COVID-19 and its related strain and stress. Young people are really in dire need for interventions that can help them cope with the challenges they face in their daily life. And Game Connect as a project is designed to emphasize the relevance of sport and basically provide an opportunity to engage youth through sport and improve their psychosocial and mental well-being. It is something that we are really proud of as we engage the young people.
Lydia, are you seeing results already? Do you think this works?
Yes, I do. I really think it does. It does work. And if I could share, we've had quite a number of learnings from implementing the Game Connect project so far. And part of it is, of course, ensuring that we find sustainable measures to keep this going. And one of them being identifying and training youth from within the communities where we are working as coaches, basically using the usual peer approach that we all know. But then also partly as a consortium, we've been able to develop a structured sports for protection curriculum that we are delivering to the young people. But then also partly the design of the projects hinges on basically us being able to demonstrate impact of sport on the lives of the young people. So we kind of do a baseline for the youth we enroll on this project, assessing their levels of depression, anxiety, psychosocial well-being, and of course the triggers of all this. And we hope to do an end line after completion of the engagement of these young people on this sport for protection curriculum. So
thanks a lot.
Yes.
Yeah, so from what I'm hearing from you is, yes, you think it's working. We might be a little bit early days, but yes, you think it's working. What you also pointed out to as well is the support through the curriculum that you're giving and peer-to-peer learning, so that actually people involved in the project themselves are actually getting trained to be able to implement, lead, work as youth leaders within the project. Are they actually youth leaders within that project from within the communities you're working with?
Yes, Amanda. So we identify the youth leaders from within the community where we are working. As you had mentioned earlier, that we work with both the refugees and host community youth. So even when we identifying the coaches, we identify both refugee and national coaches who can identify with the youth that we enroll on the project.
So one last question before I sort of then move on to Mike, because I think it's going to be very complimentary to hear from Mike what he has to say from a different perspective. But just one last question. As a CSO, as an international NGO, if you like, that is just embarked on this sort of new journey from a very long experience of working in Uganda, across Africa, would you recommend using sport in your programming with young people? And if so, what are the sorts of challenges that you need to overcome? Again, Mike's been doing this from the federal government point of view. We'll talk to Adam in a moment, that's been doing this as a foundation that is funding, a grant-giving foundation, but as an organization who's implementing, is this something that you would encourage others to do? A non-traditional sport civil society organization?
Yes, Amanda, indeed, this is the way to go. And I would really recommend this for all partners to really be a part of this. But part of what we need to do, specifically for Uganda, we need basically buy-in by the government to be able to scale up the sport for protection interventions across the different eligible populations. It's not really something that many are interested in, but it would be good if we had buy-in by the government. And then, of course, also having partners integrating the sport into their psychosocial support and care models for youth. Plus also, of course, not forgetting the issue of funding to be able to scale up these interventions. For Game Connect, if I could share, currently we are only targeting youth from 4 settlements, and that's just about 10,000 youth, 15 to 24. But Uganda as a country, I don't know whether many of you are aware that the biggest, almost 77% of our population are youth. So we are just basically working with a very tiny drop of young people. So if we could get funding and of course buy-in by the government and also have many other partners on board to really have interest in the sport for protection interventions, it would be quite great.
Thank you, Lydia. That's really a really useful direction you're putting us in terms of we're going to go to scale. We need government support. We need policy. We need government support. We need policy in place. We need the investment that's there and the right partnership. There's a whole package that needs to be in place so that what you're doing actually can be sustained and then scaled to a much greater number of youth across Uganda, but also we would hope in other countries, which is a great, I hope, segue. I hope it makes sense to everybody to actually bring Mike in at this point. Mike, I'd like us to build on ABSE's recent arrival into this world of sport for development and peace. In their international development context, Sport Canada, as a federal government body for sport, has been innovating itself and broadening from, I guess, just a traditional sort of sport development unit, so to speak, to really incorporating sport as a real tool for non-sport outcomes. And that on the domestic scene, this seems like a real breakthrough or sort of cutting edge for government. Government's not often cutting edge. Again, somebody who's actually worked in government, I guess I can say that. Just tell us maybe what you've been able to do and why, maybe just very, just in a couple of sentences, the what and the why, so that we can then actually say, how can we actually build more of that going forward? And welcome, Mike.
Yes, thanks, Amanda. Well, I can certainly say that having been involved in the sport for development and peace field for some time, that it's clear that it's a field of activity that has trouble finding its place within government departments, first of all. I would say that international development agencies tend not to recognize or prioritize the value of sport for development, in my experience. And similarly, sport ministries tend to be focused more on, of course, sport outcomes and high performance pathways. So from the government, Canadian government's perspective, and Sport Canada in particular, you've asked the why now question, and for us, it's really been linked to a seminal report on the Indigenous residential schools issue in Canada and what's been called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and its calls to action. What that report did set out, among other things, how out of step the social development conditions are for Indigenous peoples in Canada relative to non-Indigenous people. And really it triggered a whole of government reckoning on this issue. And so it afforded an opportunity for Sport Canada to look at some of what was out there in terms of some indicators, some research, some positive impacts of sport for development projects. And then in collaboration with Indigenous stakeholders, start to put together a program proposal that would use sport to support the pursuit of some of the key social development outcomes and priorities that were set out in this calls to action report. And so the result for us has been what we call the Sport for Social Development in Indigenous Communities program. And it's really been Sport Canada's first endeavor into an explicitly non-sport seeking, we're seeking non-sport outcomes really for the first time. And so while we've had other participation-based interests and activities in the past, the intentional focus on non-sport outcomes has really been something new for us.
Mike, can I just jump in there? Because it's interesting. Ollie started us by sort of talking about this sort of having to start outcomes-based if we're going to really be able to reach the potential of what this sector can really offer. Clearly, that's what Lydia's talked about as well. And then you're talking about taking that in as a sort of the starting place as well as a government sports department. How has that transition be in sort of broadening the mission of Sports Canada mandate? How's that gone down, I guess, amongst you and amongst the teams that are working on this?
Yeah, I think quite well. I think for some time there's been a sense that there was more opportunity there for Sport Canada to move really beyond just accepting the intrinsic benefits of sport participation. And I think that it's, there's been that recognition that we could move beyond just a high performance sport development orientation. I would say really this Indigenous focused nature of our work, and there's been a galvanizing effect with this Truth and Reconciliation report, really, that I think help this along. And frankly, we've seen some of our traditional sports stakeholders really also start to look into the role that they can play in supporting Indigenous focused sport for development programs as well. So it's been, I think, widely embraced.
Well, I mean, it sort of raises lots of questions right at the same time. So just the first one is, are these non-sports outcomes now formally integrated as objectives or KPIs in the actual unit itself? Because that, of course, would be a real breakthrough.
Well, certainly we are being asked to report on them, identify and put in place indicators. And, I think part of the challenge a little bit then is translating those into our expectations for civil society organizations for whom some of those practices are new. And also when we're talking about working with Indigenous communities, I think there's a recognition that there's really a scale here of maturity in relation to dealing with some of these funding programs and working with governments, and some of the frankly cumbersome sometimes and bureaucratic processes that come along with that government funding. So there are challenges still there on many fronts, but I would say it's moving in a positive direction.
That's a real breath of fresh air to have somebody from government talking about the challenges for civil society organizations of your own demands, because it's that's something I think we've heard for many years, and that's an opening to actually be able to streamline and put potentially those KPIs into the hands actually of being set by the civil society organizations themselves. One of the questions as well that's coming up, Mike, is, given this experience, I know it's quite a recent experience in Canada, but is it an experience that you think is exportable? Is it something that we could actually see happening in other countries around the world? And what would your advice be to actually being able to put in place a similar process of, I guess, transition to a sports unit actually working with civil societies to actually reach these non-sport outcomes? Because you mentioned that it's quite a challenging experience to go through.
Yeah, I would say, if we're focused on the government policy perspective, I think, what our experience has been, or what I've observed anyway, is that certainly it takes a whole of government approach. I think a recognition that we need to be operating outside of our typical silos when we're addressing broad-based government interests. And I think in the Canadian context, which may or may not be transferable, there's a unique element right now that's really galvanized around this focus on Indigenous peoples and trying to, support better community development in many ways. That's, as I say, I've been a galvanizing force. But I think really it has to do with collaboration across departments and recognizing that there are opportunities to contribute in different ways to these broader social development objectives, irrespective of whether you're working in parks or working in sport or whatever it may be. And so I think that's part of what we're recognizing. And one of the interesting examples for us is even looking at our citizenship and immigration department, for example, that's recognized that sport can play an interesting and positive role for new Canadians, newcomers to Canada, helping integrate those new Canadians into communities through sport. So
that's a fabulous example. Thanks a lot, Mike. Ollie, can I bring you in? Because also with your Commonwealth hat on as well, old hat, but also through the network, the coalition that you're working with right now, do you know of other countries which have also done this similar type of transition on a domestic level of actually a sports unit in government, a sport department in government, actually looking at those non-sport outcomes and actually starting to take that to scale?
Well, I can talk from perspective previously at the Commonwealth Secretariat, where around 2015, we identified about 40% of the 54 member countries had adopted a level of policy which spoke to using sport to deliver wider outcomes, and it was about over 60% by sort of end of last year. And I think two important milestones have really shifted the policy debate here. One, recognition of sport as an enabler of sustainable development within the SDG framework, and that was important to put that cross-government lens. And then secondly, the Kazan Action Plan adopted in 2017 that identified 36 specific SDG targets where the collective of ministries responsible for sport would work to and with governmental, cross-government colleagues, civil society in their country to deliver against those targets. A few good examples. I mean, just last week, government of Kenya announced a new sport and physical education in education policy, and the cabinet secretary there sort of said that policy will be about mainstreaming physical education sport across learning activities. So we're starting to see this whole of government approach. The Secretary General's report to the General Assembly at the end of last year, the UN Secretary General's, about 45% of the reported initiatives in that report on the UN Action Plan on Sport for Development piece related to policy integration. So we're seeing a shift, certainly. There's still a challenge in going from policy intent to policy implementation and investment in that policy implementation, and that remains a challenge.
So just one little question to add to that, because we've heard, both you and Mike talk about some ministries. We haven't heard you talk so much about ministries of health. For example, taking your Kenya example, are we actually seeing ministries of health also, from your experience, from where you sit, involved in this shift, in this policy shift? Yes, then we've got the big challenge of actually translating policy to action.
And the Ministry of Health's involvement is a good example in terms of Jamaica. And Jamaica have utilising sport and physical activity embedded in their National Development Plan, Vision 2030. It's very much with that physical activity lens is health engagement. I think there is an opportunity to look at those multiple returns on investment. As a coalition, we're working in the UK with a range of actors, government and civil society, on the role social prescription and green prescription can play, both supporting physical activity, but broader mental health and wellbeing outcomes. And it's clear that civil society organisations in their range of guises have a key role to play in that. So I think, yes, there is, and often health is the first stop for that cross-government approach, but it's that continuum from the individual physical activity and the outcomes that come from that type of approach to the multiple returns that can come from the group, the facilitated physical activity and sport with the other intentional interventions around it, and then the policy lens to scale that type of approach is the important question. Thanks a lot, Ollie. I'm going to bring Adam in right away, because again, there's so much intentionality, if you like, through the work that Laureus does, but possibly less on the policy side, trying to actually understand who and what Laureus is as a sort of connector and bridger, grant giver, would be really useful as well, Adam. Let's come back and talk. I think maybe just to sort of kickstart understanding sort of where you start from, let's see this fabulous video that you have agreed to share with us, and then we'll just jump back into the conversation.
Today, they will face the toughest opponents in the world. Tougher than any world champion. Stronger than any gold medalist. Meaner than any heavyweight fighter. Opponents that have been crushing spirits for generations. But in this park, on this field, in this gym, these children will defeat discrimination, defeat violence, defeat inequality. For more than 20 years, Laureus programs have empowered children with education, independence, and a life free of violence. Every time sport defeats disadvantage, everyone wins.
Thanks, Adam, for joining us, and a great byline at the end, which I'm sure resonates with everybody on the panel as well, in terms of how we can really use sport. I guess just to sort of get going, given that Laureus has got this really big reach, 250 different organizations that are receiving grants over 50 countries, and we can go through lots of statistics, but maybe we'll try and avoid them. So you're funding lots of different CSOs working through sport for positive social outcomes. But you've also questioned your own programming, if I've got it right, and shifted from something which is a more traditional grant-based approach, project-based approach, to what some people are calling a place-based approach. And it'll be useful to know, basically, why you made this shift, what it is, what does it actually look like? Maybe you can illustrate that with some of the great examples from those 50 different countries, 250 organizations, to actually bring that to life a little bit.
I think I don't want to be, I have to be careful with how you frame that question, because I don't want to be critical of the non-place-based work we're doing, which is I still think vital. But it comes down to the points that Mike and Ollie have made, and that Lydia referenced in their work, is intentional focus on non-sporting outcomes. And that's what we've been doing since day one. As Laureus was founded 21 years ago under the patronage of Nelson Mandela, not because he wanted more people to kick a ball, but because of the role he saw sport play in rebuilding post-apartheid South Africa. So I can't remember if I didn't see if in the version of the video it just played, it referenced the 6 million young people we've impacted over the last 20 years. But that isn't them playing sport. That's them getting out of gangs in Rio de Janeiro, or girls staying in education and out of child marriage in Kenya or Nepal, or kids getting into college in Brooklyn. And I'm incredibly proud of us having impacted those 6 million children, because those are huge numbers for us, and we've raised $200 million to do it, and that's incredible. But those are small numbers on a global scale. So what we had to try and figure out is how do we move from changing the lives of 200 kids in a community to trying to change a system, and therefore changing the lives of everyone in that community. And we do that in different ways, but one of them, as you say, is the place-based approach we've taken, which is back in 2014, we looked at things and we said, what about the areas where in some countries, in some of those 50 countries you referenced, we might just have one program working with a couple of hundred kids. But in some cities, some parts of the world, we have multiple partners, multiple people committed to using sport to help change young people's lives. So we wanted to look at how we could bring them together and have the whole be greater than the sum of the parts. And that started in New Orleans in the States, which had been a big focus of philanthropy and funding after Hurricane Katrina, but often without much of a plan, and crucially without much local guidance and local leadership. And we said, how do we move the dial here, and built a collective impact approach? And we've gone back and forth on whether that's a big C, big I, or small c, small I, and don't need to get into collective impact definitions here, but a place-based approach where we create that local coalition and empower local leaders to make the decisions around the outcome areas they want to tackle through sport. And then we're supporting that local drive with grants, capacity building, professional development. And then we've scaled that over the last 7 years from New Orleans to Chicago, New York, Atlanta in the US, London and Paris in Europe, and Hong Kong and New Delhi in India. But importantly, the framework is the same, but each of those locations has its own defined outcome area. So using sport for education outcomes in Atlanta is very different to using sport for gender justice outcomes in New Delhi. But collectively, we start to build momentum and can look to get government buy-in somewhat and start to change systems as much as we can with the level of resource that we have and the ambition of attracting more to achieve the outcomes we're talking about here.
So Adam, you've already talked to it, this question of, and it's just coming back again and again, question of scale. I mean, it is very much the question of this webinar, this idea of strengthening what exists, but also growing the numbers to actually really have greater impact on more people. What are the success factors then of your place-based or other approaches? But if it's place-based that you think is actually what is really working on the programming side, how can we actually grow that to scale? Is it about different forms of investment? Is it about more training? What are the areas, even if each context is different? I'm sure that you've actually pulled those threads together to say, here are the success factors, because Laureus is not going to be able to fund and grant give every civil society organization around the world. So beyond Laureus, there needs to be something that we can actually make sort of bigger. As you said, it's got to be more than our individual contributions. It's got to be the whole.
Absolutely, and I could answer that from a couple of small to large or large to small, macro to micro. What I want to say for one thing is I think we'll be talking in this webinar over the next 45 minutes or so remaining about more funding and more resource and more scalability. Actually, what we're talking about is saving money. Government should be saving money by investing in this as a cost-effective, preventative solution. Like putting more money into the sport for development sector will be of a cost benefit to society in the long term, and that's, to me, fairly indisputable. You asked about the success factors. I would say it's local leadership, local collaboration, and for us, often that is being the bridge between large funders and small local organizations. Because often when government just decides we want to put millions of dollars into any space, it doesn't actually get where it needs to go, as we all know. And I think that's where structures like this can play a role. And as you said, it's about training, it's about investing in human capacity. There are 6 million sports coaches in the USA, but only a third of them are actually trained in positive youth development versus trying to win games. And those are the coaches where young people drop out of programming and girls drop out of sport when they hit puberty, and all the other statistics we know. The right training of coaches, the right investment, human capacity into the organizations working in this space completely changes what those numbers look like. So we really need to work to make sure that from an organizational side, but right down to a coach level, the system is focused on how we are investing in improving young people's health for now and for the rest of their lives.
Thank you, Adam. I'm just going to ask Lydia a quick question, and I don't want to put you on the spot, Lydia, but would you want to go to Laureus and say, Laureus, come and fund us? You mentioned earlier that you're only able to actually at the moment reach a limited number of young people in Uganda, and that there are so many more out there. I guess that's one question. Adam, would you be interested in funding international organizations like AVSI, knowing that they don't fall within the sort of the sport for development box? They're outside it at the moment. So maybe first Lydia and then Adam.
Yes, for sure. I would want to walk up to Adam right now after the webinar. I will send him an email and ask for funds. Yes, as I was mentioning, just sharing the experience, we are reaching out to really quite a limited number of youth compared to those that need the help that they need. If I could just speak about it in a broader perspective of the refugee settlements that we have quite a very big number of refugees in Uganda, as you may all know, and quite a number of settlements. We are only working in 4 settlements out of about 10 of very congested settlements with young people. So we are basically not reaching out to all the youth that would need to reach out to, but then also not offering as much as we would want to offer them because of the limited funds that we have. So for sure, the need for more funding is there for us to be able to reach out to all the youth that need the support, but then also be able to give a holistic package that we can be able to provide to these young people. Of course, as we all know, to be able to get to the required social outcomes, sometimes you may need a little bit of other surplus and other pluses on top of the sport activities. So it would really be important if the funding was there to be able to have that and then be able to provide the effective support that is needed by the young people.
Thanks, Lydia. So Adam, back to you in terms of this, ability in terms of the I guess the models that we're using to actually see this area of sport for development grow and include other organizations. How easy is it to be able to actually bring the AVSIs of the world into the organizations, into the sort of the model that you're working with at the moment?
I mean, we would love to do more of it. I think it's interesting, even the way you framed the question. It's interesting that we have this small sport for development sector struggling to get by, and then we have these huge health sectors and juvenile justice sectors and all of these areas where the budgets are so many multiples of that. And the question is always like, oh, could we? And I don't mean the question of us, but the question of everyone is like, oh, how can we find some money to test this? And I'm like, wait, no, why isn't the juvenile justice system finding the money to test it and keep kids out of prison, keep kids out of juvenile detention, etc.? But to your question, we would love to discuss with Lydia, with any organization that's not using sport as an intervention, or intentional sport for development programming as an intervention, how they could do that. Because again, as you say, this is about taking it to scale, and that's a really powerful way of doing that. I think the last thing I would say is it needs to be aligned and core to their work, and that comes back again to the outcomes, because it doesn't work. Scaling doesn't work if it's like a little side project for someone. It needs to be very much a core part of what an organization like AVSI is trying to achieve on a daily basis and an ongoing basis.
So I mean, one of the things that's already come up, and you talked about Adam, Ollie in one of his P's as well was in there in terms of people, skills, and workforce. This question of capacity. Do we even have the capacity to be able to scale? And being able to actually get the right people there who have the skills, the capacity in the right place at the right time. And that's clearly a real challenge. And Lydia, what I'm hearing from you is that part of the work in Uganda that you're doing is partly building capacity, local capacity, through the programs that you're doing. I'd like to just bring in Julien as well, as somebody who is growing his own capacity right now, because it really sort of talks to what are the sorts of coaches that we really do need to be able to see that potential really met. And Julien, maybe as somebody who has gone through your own journey already, training to become a sports coach right now, but having started off studying international relations, moving into working in a civil society organization in the UK with the Youth Charter, doing volunteering work, sort of trying to match those. What has been your motivation to saying today, okay, I'm actually now going to continue my training? So maybe you could talk about your motivation, and then we'll just try and work out why there aren't more opportunities for more people to be doing what you're doing.
Thank you, Amanda. So as you said, it was part of a journey, a long progressive journey. I first learned about sport for development and peace during my studies at university, and I just wanted to know more about it. So I had this opportunity to work with the Youth Charter, which is it's an NGO in the UK that promotes the role and value of sports for disaffected young people from disadvantaged communities. They have developed some programs and they advocate public institutions and sports institutions to implement these programs with young people. So when I was working with the Youth Charter, I learned a lot about some vision and some theoretical knowledge of how sport can be used as a tool for positive social change. And then I wanted to have some field experience. So when I came back in France, I volunteered in a civil society organization which empowers young people from disadvantaged communities through sport and professional inclusion. So it was really interesting to see the link that can be made between physical activity and other programs with non-sport outcomes.
Just to jump back in then, Julien. So today you've made that decision to go and do further training to be able to match the physical activity sports coach, more traditional training, if you like, with your motivation for actually bringing the two together. You're doing that in France. Maybe you can just tell us a bit more about why you think there are not more opportunities, or what maybe needs to change to create more opportunities for more people to actually do what you're trying to do. Because it sounds to me, and we've heard that from Adam, we've heard from Ollie as well, we've heard the attempts to sort of fill those gaps on the ground from Lydia. You know, I'm sure Mike in Sport Canada, they have some capacity building activities with their partners as well, but it all seems quite limited. What do you think needs to change in the system so that actually this is a much stronger system and we're actually getting the right people in the right place at the right time?
I think we need a better recognition of the value of sport for development and peace in policies, but also in society as a whole, because I feel like people don't know a lot about sport for development. People know sports like sport for performance, they know social work, but the intersection between the two, like using sport for non-sport outcomes, for health, social impact, it's hidden because people don't know it. They don't know about it. So I think what is needed is, yes, a better recognition of this from policies, from also from the public institutions and public funding. And we also need some training and capacity building, because so I want to work in sport for development and peace, but I feel like I lack some skills. I think I have the skills and motivation for the development part of sport for development, but I lack some sport skills. So that's why I am going to follow a training starting in a few months. I hope so. It's a training to become a sports coach. So I hope then I will have both the social and sports skills and capacity to be able to work, to use sports as a tool for social change.
Julien, thank you so much. You've so well described the disconnect and how you're the one that has actually had to yourself make the connections, and then they're not easy to make because of that lack of recognition in society. And in a way, that's how we started the webinar today. And it's exactly, I think, what Ollie was describing right at the beginning. And it's been really useful. You're coming in to talk about that. I don't know if there's anybody on the panel that wants to comment and build on what Julien has just said, because it's really, that disconnect is really important. It's absolutely the heart of what we're trying to talk about right now. Ollie, do you want to just come straight in on that?
Certainly. I think it's really interesting in terms of the skills and competencies, particularly in the significant workforce that already exists across civil society. And we sort of spoke earlier around 54 million paid staff of 350 million volunteers across 40 countries. And so it's about what type of competencies, what sort of training and development can be embedded and mainstreamed within a workforce that's already there and active. And a lot of the communities that might be often marginalised or outside of traditional sport and physical activity provision. And I think that is a workforce policy issue. That is a national skills and framework issue. There's a really good example. I'll zero in on Namibia. That there's a partnership between Ministry of Education, Arts and Culture, UNICEF, and an NGO community-based organisation called SCORE, which is about embedding sport for development competencies and capabilities within the teacher training system across the country. So that's specifically education, as opposed to potentially community development and out with, but it's a different policy approach to scale. That's not just about investing in particular projects and trying to take them to scale. It's building that workforce. There's a project in Europe, European Observatory of Sport, which is working on engaging with national skills frameworks to look at an actual skill definition for sport for development workforce or development practitioners who have sport in their roles. So these type of policy type workforce interventions, I think, are critical.
Thanks a lot, Ollie. Adam, over to you.
I think I would just add, Amanda, that it's important to remember it needs to be set at that local level. Julian does not need me to tell him what issues need addressing in Paris or how to do that. Our program leaders and coaches in New Delhi don't need me as a white guy from the UK based in New York telling them how to solve issues in New Delhi. And the indigenous communities that Mike mentioned know the solutions. They know how to affect the issues, and that's critical because it's an equity issue as well. It's a gender equity issue. It's a racial equity issue. We just published research showing that young men of color in particular benefited at an even higher level than our broader group of young people around the positive youth development outcomes in this work. But that is driven by those local leaders and by local coaches who are actually working with young people as Julian wants to do.
So Adam, just to be clear, you are funding, Laureus does though fund and support that capacity building. I mean, what sort of proportion of the funding is going, into that part as opposed to, I don't know, some other part of your program implementation? Is that a major part of what you actually invest in?
Yeah, it's an absolutely critical part of what we invest in, both financially, with our funding, we will support, human capacity, we will support organizations' growth, but also in that we and others devote a huge amount of time, resource, the efforts of our programs team, the efforts of our partners in upskilling organizations who whether that's across their child safeguarding or their finance management or their impact measurement, or anything else that goes into running a successful organization. And as I just mentioned in the Q&A, we're involved in an initiative in the US right now, which is targeted at training 1 million new coaches in positive youth development. And so all those different parts of training and capacity building are absolutely critical.
So it is a core part. I guess, Mike, quick question to you, and then we need to go into our last part of the webinar, but a quick question to you as well as part of this, coming from a federal unit working with, you're working directly with Indigenous peoples organizations working through sport. Is there a capacity building training aspect of the funding stream that you have at the moment?
So there isn't a training piece to it, Amanda, per se, but just to give some context, 60% of the program funding that we provide are to a specific subset of organizations called provincial or territorial Aboriginal sport bodies, so responsible for Indigenous sport within their province or territory. And what we've done in the allocation of that funding to those PTSBs, as we call them, is afford them really flexibility for them to allocate that funding as they see fit based on their local circumstance to either capacity build, some combination of building their capacity and to supporting the projects that they deem the most appropriate in their particular context. So there is that piece, although that being said, I think there still are gaps, as I alluded to earlier, where we're looking into ways in which, could we be supporting capacity in other ways, finding organizations that can help support those civil society organizations with their ability to put forward a proper application, to have technological capacity, because as I say, there really is a range of capacity in the groups that we've seen, the communities that we've seen applying into our program.
Thanks, Mike. And I guess it's a bit of a challenge to you as well. I mean, a challenge from the panelists here of saying this is so important and really needs to be highlighted, as opposed to being part of a general sort of a pot of, what you're doing, you do it best. I'm obviously completely paraphrasing and going to an extreme, but I think there's a really clear message coming out amongst a number of the messages today of how vital this support is in making, I think Julien just said it so nicely, in making the connections between the sport and the development and social outcomes, and actually seeing them as one, and actually building capacity for people to be able to take that on board and carry out the programs to be able to do that. I'm going to actually, at this point though, because I've just had a look at the clock, which has just made me a bit surprised, we would like to, at this point, because we've talked a lot about how you're doing, what you're doing, what a lot of the challenges are, I'd like to turn to each of you to come back on what would be your one recommendation if we really are going to strengthen and grow the number of civil society organizations who are able to really be effective and reach their potential in this space of both health and social and development outcomes. What would be your one major recommendation to take this to scale, to reach its potential? We might be talking about actions, we might be talking about policies, partnership. You've all mentioned some. What is the one big one that would really help us? And at this point, the us is it would certainly help the World Health Organization in actually being able to as well put its energies where they need to go. I think we might, because Mike, we were just with you. So Mike, what would be your one big recommendation?
Yeah, I don't want to suggest it's a grand recommendation, and it draws back to something that I suggested earlier. And I think, speaking from the government perspective, it really is. I think about this notion of treating the use of sport as a whole of government, from a whole of government perspective, and recognizing that sport has the power to attract and retain the interest of youth, and in so doing can be leveraged to intentionally pursue these other benefits. And for me, it's about expanding that interpretation of what excellence in sport means, to realizing that excellence in sport can also mean its ability to engage the disenfranchised. And I think that's a big part of what's been going on in our situation.
Mike, thanks so much. You were able to talk both about that sort of more systems thinking in government, where it's really particularly challenging, as well as where sport has this incredible role to play with, as you put it, the disenfranchised, those who actually really are left behind, those who are the most, the least able really to actually participate in sport for a whole range of different reasons. Moving on from Mike, I'm going to ask Lydia. I know it's a hard ask from everybody, so I'm sure you've all been preparing yourselves for this one. Lydia, your recommendation, sitting in the with your AVSI hat on, what would be your one recommendation which would really, I guess, sort of shift this space, reach its potential?
My one would be donors and the CSO or partners' mindset change and capacity shift regarding the sport for protection interventions and programming. Basically, talking about meaningful engagement of youth through the design, implementation, and delivery. So if partners can be able to pick interest in what sport can be able to do in the lives of the young people, it would really be quite beneficial, because then we would be able to demonstrate the impact, and more still, then we would be able to get more funding from donors, because we are able to pitch that it is an intervention, or it is a model that can be able to work and help the young people. So kind of it's cascaded in a way. When the CSOs change their mindset, then the donors would, and then also the government would.
Thank you, Lydia. I love your cascading image of that in terms of the importance of the mindset of CSOs, and that very sort of self-critical nature of maybe we should have been doing this before, but at least we've started doing this now. In terms of as well what that means from a donor or investor point of view, and then also clearly, and you talked about that earlier, in terms of those partnerships and as well the government policy enablers to actually make this type of work possible. So the multiple strategies, but also your cascading, starting with yourselves, I thought was really useful and insightful on this. Julien, back to you. Again, given the journey that you've been on, but also somebody who actually has taken an external viewpoint through your professional experience and your studies, I guess when it comes to particularly that training piece, again, what would be your one key recommendation?
I think I speak from the French perspective and the French context. I think it would be creating a training program that makes sport, social, health, because currently in France we have some sports training, some social training, health training, education training, but there is no one training that is focusing on every dimensions. So I think this is what we need, because for now, if someone wants to work with in sports for development and peace, they have to go on different trainings, different paths. So it would be very much easier if there was one specific training. I think this is my recommendation, and it has to be some official training. I mean, it has to be integrated into the structure of studies and training, like recognized by the states, because I think some civil society organizations are already provided trainings from their own communities. But yeah, it has to be some national training.
Thanks, Julien, for that additional recommendation, as the training of which there's real value in what organizations, private civil society organizations can offer is clearly not the same as something which is part of a national program. And that gives it a very different recognition, potentially rigor, relevance, and something that as young people you can actually go and use afterwards. And that's a really important point as well. Adam, I'm going to turn to you again. Your recommendation, because we've heard so much, everybody's talked so much in terms of the system, and we've all talked about multiple strategies. What would be that recommendation that you would want to make?
You've asked me before, Ollie, so I could steal his 4P thing from the start of this session, but I would focus on, I would say, investing in it as a whole of government piece. I know funding is the easy answer, and so I will try to build on that, but investing in it as a whole of government piece, as a cross-sector piece. You know, most CSOs, NGOs, charities spend their lives trying to do things as cheaply as possible so funders will sign them off. And that needs a mindset shift, because we should be pouring resources into this work. Like, it should be in city government planning, urban planning, because it makes cities nicer places to be. It should be in justice system planning because it reduces crime. It should be in health systems planning because it reduces everything from diabetes to cancer to mental illness. And for the healthcare professionals on here, there is categorical evidence of all of those things. But then this sector organizations in the sector delivering this work spend their time scrabbling around for a few £1,000s, dollars, euros here and there, rather than being part of a system that's spending millions or billions and could be saying, actually, we could spend significantly less if we address the issue by investing in this work up front. And Amanda, just a quick digression is there's a question about one of the stats I cited and where it came from. The stat about trained coaches in positive youth development was an Aspen Institute study in 2020, and the large training program that we're involved in is with the Susan Crown Exchange and some other amazing organizations as a result of that. And my final thing to Dave in the Q&A is Ollie has posted some information in the chat as well, which is worth looking at.
And Adam, thanks. And I'm just going to sort of draw you back into that model, which is, it's a funding model, but of course behind that there's a lot more than that. It's about, I guess, more about how do we scale and who takes on the responsibility, the role of scaling, and should that responsibility really sit with a sort of a laureus as a grant-giving organization, or should it sit somewhere else? What is the sustainable model? Because the sustainable model, of course, is the sort of model which Lydia's going to be really interested in, Julien's going to be really interested in, Mike's already playing a role in that, and Ollie's trying to sort of connect everybody across that. But what does that sustainable model actually really look like? Because that's still a bit of an issue for me.
Yeah, and it really needs some thought. Any model that just relies entirely on philanthropy for sustainability is is at risk and is not long-term sustainable. We have amazing partners, you know, in the corporate where I can reel off lists of sponsors of Mercedes-Benz, IWC, MUFG, Nike, people who invest in this money. We have individual donors. We have the likes of Comic Relief and other non-profits and foundations who fund in this space. And we do have some government work. The Mayor of London's office is involved in our work using sport for social integration in London. So it's not that this is not happening at a government level, but for it to happen at a systems level, there needs to be significantly more money in. And I do think that there's an onus on us as an organizations like us and the coalition that Ollie leads to be looking at where the model can be developed and where different solutions might present different funding options. I think that the thing I would add as well is that whether it's the Sport for Development Coalition that Ollie leads, whether it's an organization like Laureus as an intermediary funder, that intermediary step is very necessary because the money does not get from up here to organizations doing amazing work in communities with a couple of hundred kids without the kind of the collaborative work and those intermediary steps, because the people, and I'm sure Mike could speak powerfully about this in Canada, the people in those indigenous communities and communities of color, in communities in the global south, are like the traditional philanthropic models and the traditional funding models have often excluded those people. So finding ways around that as well is critical.
Thanks, Adam, and thank you again for also being willing to put yourself into question in terms of the model, the philanthropic model as well, but also to give some space to that connecting transition conduit and supporting conduit that you can play as well. That does leave us just with Ollie. Ollie, you are coming in just as you started, sort of at the end, in terms of what your one recommendation would be. And I know it's a really hard call for you because you really do see across the whole of this movement. But if there was really one major game changer, I guess, what do you think that would be?
A challenge all stakeholders to take a step back and disaggregate what level they're investing at different components of building a sustainable system. Now, let me say what I think I mean by that. I'll use the example in the UK now, health is moving to an integrated care system and looking to organise, there's health delivery at a neighbourhood level, thousands or 10,000, at a place level, 100,000, and then at what they call a system level in the millions. That requires different level of engagement, different level of people, skills and workforce at those different levels, requires different policy frameworks, requires different places and spaces to serve at those different levels, and indeed a different methodology and approach to how we engage programmatically or policy at those different levels. I think there's a danger often, particularly in that intersection of health, sport and physical activity, wider social outcomes, to often perhaps either focus at the very top level and then right down at the programmatic level. And you see large international actors working in one community only, as opposed to trying to work at supporting the element of the system that they can support. Likewise, there's a growing and important community of communities who are saying this intervention, this tool is important. This tool works in our context for this reasons and for these people, but are often only focused at a programmatic level. I know the challenges, I know that coming together, forming more coherent, more systemic networks, coalitions, connections to speak with a larger voice at that different level of the system and develop that political will, develop that momentum as a collective, requires, even for the smallest neighbourhood level organisations, a part of their time investment to look at policy levels. It might be at municipal, it might be more at that place or even at system level. So the recommendation would be for all of us at whatever size our organisation, whatever our focus, to take that step back and say, what level of investment is directly at the delivery, human, financial, workforce investment, and what is trying to build that sustainable system, whether a neighbourhood, place, system, national or international level, because then we're not waiting from one investment to the next. We have a system which is able to actually scale by mobilising civil society, by mobilising the range of actors to embed and mainstream sport and physical activity to give us that double return. The social outcomes, but at the same time, we're getting more people moving, more people physically active. And in our current context globally, where we know that physical inactivity is a key comorbidity or a key contributor to serious implications of COVID, this issue's possibly never been more important.
Ollie, thank you so much. It's fantastic to have had you. I mean, you really brought together, I guess, the sort of our 90 minutes of conversation. I think all of you have in that, you putting together your recommendations. It really pinpointed not just where we are right now, but where we actually need to get to. And you've all talked to that real potential, I guess, with passion, but also with some rigor, and behind that with real research. So at this point, I'd like to bring Fiona back in. Fiona, this is your chance. It's always hard at the end of our webinars, I know. This one is no easier than the others to actually pull together and to wrap up and bring out some of those key messages that we have heard today. It's also my chance to really extend a huge thanks to all the panelists for a fantastic conversation, but we haven't yet stopped. Fiona, over to you to try and wrap this up.
Well, thank you, Amanda, and let me extend my thanks to the excellent panelists. The discussion has been really rich and interesting. We're seeing that from the comments in the chat box. This is one of the hardest. You mentioned it being a difficult role. I certainly feel under some pressure with the diversity, the depth, and the importance of the conversation, as Ollie's just said, at such an important time. Let me have a go. I mean, this has just been a very forward-looking, challenging discussion about how we can bring greater visibility to the work and opportunities of sport for the social outcomes, for the society's benefits. We know it's not new. We heard it's not new. We heard that there's evidence behind it, good evidence behind it, on the outcomes it can deliver. And we heard it was vital for some groups, particularly youth, particularly countries and regions where there is a large proportion of their population. It really can be a valuable approach for improving development and health. However, it's simply not at scale. And so the panelists were challenged and shared with us their views on it. And in no order and with no P's, although I was trying to get 5, I'm going to have to just speak in my language here. We've got to scale through capacity building, scale through people, and that's calling for qualifications, formal, in the sport development and peace area, the use of sport, and in the in-service and other opportunities there are. Invest in people, invest in their training, and we can scale through that. We can also scale through policy, and we've got to have better policy integration, not just within the sport, and that is progress we heard from Canada, but also policy integration across the many areas where sport can be a contribution. We heard some lovely remarks about that from Adam. It should be in many policy agendas across government, which is the third area. We need to scale by making this a whole of government agenda. It needs to be recognized, and that's a key consistent call from our panelists and the contributions in the Q&A. We've got to bring visibility. Governments need to understand the value and the critical role it can contribute. The civil society themselves, those in it, but more importantly those not, sport, many other government departments, private sector as well. It does seem the title was right, that it's hidden. So our challenge is to bring visibility, which I call for greater advocacy collectively together. But we've also need a mind shift. And the mind shift is about how we invest in this and how we think about sport. So mind shift in actually seeing its full potential, the not just double returns, Ollie, multiple returns, I'm sure you'd agree when we look at them all. And a mind shift in how we invest, investing to see it a return and a saving, not a cost. And I'm going to invite you all to come to week 6 of our reINVENT, because how we think about the investment, how we can invest smarter is very much the focus there. And we thank the colleagues who've been adding questions about accountability, because it is an integral part of scaling, is showing evidence, not just numbers of attendees, but really doing better on accountability. That's the best I can do. And it was fabulous. And what I'm really pleased about is we have a recording and we make a highlight video that will be available within the week. But let us pause to look forward to next week, the 5th of our series of 8, where we're going to turn to pick up the agenda of how technology in all its shapes and forms can be applied with innovation to scaling physical activity and sport for all. Please join us. Please look out for information that's being circulated now, and you can see the QR code there. Number 5 in the series, looking at digital. Let me turn back to thank our fantastic speakers today, your contributions, your questions of each other's, and challenging all of us. And thank the audience, thank my co-organisers. A very good day to all of you. Back to you, Amanda.
Thank you very much, Fiona. And I think on that note, this is where we actually say thank you to everybody for participating, as Fiona just had. For me, again, one last thank you to the panelists, to Julien, to Ollie, to Adam, to Mike, to Lydia. It was fantastic having you from around the world actually in one space, in my afternoon, your mornings, others' evenings. And we look forward to seeing as many of you as possible next Thursday as well.